That wraps up this job. The owner is starting cross-country this week and wanted to be sure his car's in tip-top shape.
I see. He didn't want a chance being left in the lurch in the mountains or desert because some small detail was overlooked.
That's right, Tech. It's close attention to the details that spells the difference between a good job and comebacks, whether the cars are used on long trips or just around town.
I'm with you all the way on that one, Gene. Say, will you look who just walked in? The boss's son. Must be home from school for the summer.
Hiya, fellas. Boy, am I glad to see you again.
Hi, Tom.
Nice to have you back.
Again.
Why the coveralls, Tom? Going to join us again this summer?
Oh, no such luck, Gene. Dad wants me to spend my time in the used car department. But before I take up my exile on the used car lot, I wanted to have a good powwow with you and Tech. You know, sort of review the service tips you tried to teach me last summer.
As long as it's okay with the boss, I'll be glad to spend the rest of the afternoon giving away all of my trade secrets. How to keep your satisfied customer batting average high and your comebacks low in one easy lesson.
That's exactly what I had in mind, Gene.
Okay, let's start with the electrical system. You know, Tom, most road service calls are in response to electrical problems. Most of these breakdowns can be avoided by proper preventive maintenance and closer attention to details when servicing the car.
Well, how about some examples?
In the first place, dirt and moisture on top of the battery cause self-discharge, so it's good practice to give the battery a good scrubbing periodically. Here's how we do it. Remove the battery to clean it. That way you can wash all the mess down the drain instead of splashing it all over the engine compartment and on the fender. Just be careful not to get any cleaning solution in the cells.
Getting the battery out gives Gene a chance to flush off the battery tray, too.
Right. And before I hook up the battery, I clean the battery cable terminals and the battery posts to eliminate resistance possibilities. Then, after the terminals are tightened, I spread a coating of petrolatum on the terminals and battery posts to reduce the formation of corrosion.
I see, Gene. Yeah, but tell me, isn't battery care less critical since we went to the 12-volt system?
Yes, thanks to the concealed battery cell connectors, self-discharge isn't quite so troublesome so long as the sealing isn't punctured. Now remember, if holes are punched in the top compound by cell tester prods, they must be sealed with a hot soldering iron. If you use a torch, you're liable to have an explosion.
Say, I never thought about that. Would you sure straighten me out on battery cleaning? Can you do the same on battery sulfation and fast chargers without getting into college chemistry?
Sure thing, Tom. As a battery is discharged, the active plate material is changed into lead sulfate. This is normal. However, if a battery remains in a discharged state, the lead sulfate hardens. The acid can't get to the active plate material, and the battery capacity is reduced. When you try to charge a sulfated battery, the hard lead sulfate areas don't want to change back into active plate material and acid. A fast charge won't restore a sulfated battery.
Well, why is that?
A high charging rate will cause overheating, excessive gassing, buckled plates, and shedding of active plate material without correcting the sulfation problem.
A sulfated battery must be completely discharged and then slow charged. This takes time, but there aren't any shortcuts. Checking battery reaction to a low charging rate is the only way to determine whether the battery can be saved. But remember, Tom, we're talking about trouble prevention, not trouble correction after something has failed. On a tune-up job, I never assume that the battery and charging system are okay. Any mechanic that does is sticking his neck out. On every tune-up job, the first thing I do is check the specific gravity of the battery. Low gravity means potential trouble. If it's not corrected, I'm apt to get a comeback and a dissatisfied customer to boot.
In other words, spot and correct potential battery and charging system problems before they become serious performance troubles. That's part of the master touch for top performance.
Right. You know, if Gene tried to tell you all he knows about battery and charging system service, we'd be here until quitting time. This issue of the reference book, The Master Touch, is loaded with common sense tips on batteries and alternators.
Read it while you're waiting for used car customers. Right now, here are some important ignition system tips. Whenever I do any work on the distributor or the ignition system, I remove the distributor cap and scrub it inside and out with a lukewarm, mild liquid detergent solution.
Just be sure you mix the solution according to the instructions on the detergent label.
A clean cap is darn good insurance against hard starting and misfiring. You see, dirt and moisture inside the cap give the secondary voltage a short circuit between the cap inserts. Eventually, carbon tracks form and the cap will have to be replaced.
Arcing can take place on the outside of the cap, too. Like Gene says, keeping the cap clean inside and out is good insurance against comebacks.
Well, I'll sure keep that in mind.
Keep this in mind, too. Don't use compressed air to dry the cap. The moisture and oil normally found in compressed air lines can contaminate the cap and you'll be right back where you started. Don't forget to clean the ignition coil tower, too. Carbon tracking there will kill the whole ignition system.
Speaking of coil towers, keep the primary ignition wire terminals away from the coil tower to reduce the possibility of high-tension sparking down the tower and through the primary wire to ground.
That's a good tip, Tech. And here's another. There are only two places in the entire ignition system where ignition voltage should jump an air gap, from rotor to tower terminal and across the spark plug gap. Electrical leakage or air gaps anywhere else spell trouble. Here's what to look for. Cables that might have been punctured by test equipment. Also look for cracked or otherwise damaged insulation.
If you use an approved adapter, you won't puncture cables when you connect the timing light.
Sound advice, Tech. Loose-fitting cable connections at the distributor cap, spark plugs, and coil can also cause voltage loss due to arcing. And when you install cables, be sure you pinch the nipples to force out trapped air to make sure the terminals and nipples are fully seated.
Hey, Gene, this is something new since last year. Champion plugs in a Mopar box. How come?
Chrysler Corporation has switched over to Champion plugs. Use the Mopar or Crico spark plug application and cross-reference catalog so you'll be sure of installing the right plugs in the car you're working on.
Now here's another new wrinkle. A spark plug gasket must be used when plugs are installed in a slant 6 engine. The aluminum tubes alone won't ensure proper sealing or prevent overheating of the plugs.
Correct spark plug torque is essential to good engine performance. Loose plugs or dirty plug seats will cause plugs to overheat and burn at low mileage. Over-tightened plugs may misfire because the pressure changes the spark gap.
New plug gaskets should always be used when plugs are installed.
For good performance, spark plugs should be serviced every 8,000 miles. They should be cleaned, regapped, and reinstalled. Before you regap them, however, use a thin, fine file to dress down the end of the center electrode.
Why is that important?
A smooth square end on the center electrode gives a better spark. A plug with a rounded electrode requires higher voltage and is apt to misfire.
But don't ever file down the side electrode. You'll weaken it and it may distort from the heat and change the gap.
Boy, I asked for tips and I'm sure getting them. What's next, Gene?
I think we've come to the part of the lesson where Tech usually says, "Someone better turn the record."
You may have the master touch on tune-ups, but you don't have the master's voice for handling the turn frame.
Okay, Tom, let's get into some of the fine points of distributor service. Get the distributor out of the car where you can look it over and see what service is needed.
And remember, new points in a condenser aren't a cure-all for ignition troubles. Sometimes they should be replaced, but it's not always necessary.
That's right, Tom. These points have a clean, grayish, sandblasted appearance. There's no evidence of burning or pitting. I wouldn't hesitate to use them in my own car or my best customer's car. Now, here's another set. Care to guess what caused these points to burn?
Well, they're quite blue-looking. Could that be a faulty condenser?
Nope. High charging system voltage was at the bottom of the trouble. Voltage regulation is something I always check when I run into blued points like these. On this particular job, the voltage regulator adjustment was okay. A loose field circuit connection at the voltage regulator caused all the trouble. A loose field circuit connection anywhere between the battery and alternator field terminal could have caused the trouble.
Then new points and a condenser wouldn't have avoided a comeback on that job, I guess.
That's the point I wanted to make, Tom. Installing new parts without trying to find out why the old ones failed is bound to lower your reputation and raise your comeback average. Here's another condition to look out for. See this gummy black deposit on the points and on the stationary point bracket?
Yeah, it looks like burned oil. Well, now, what could cause that? Besides oily hands when the points were installed.
Well, it might be caused by too much oil in the felt wick or too much cam lube. Whatever the cause, try to find and correct it. These points burned because the point gap was too narrow. See how the rubbing block is worn down? Could be due to lack of proper cam lube.
Is the proper cam lube that important?
It sure is, Tom. That's why the new Mopar and Cryco contact sets for Chrysler-built distributors contain a capsule of the correct type and quantity of cam lubricant for one installation. This assures proper lubrication for the rubbing block.
Be sure you wipe off the old lube before you put on the new.
Here's something else on those new point sets. 2 ventilated contact sets service all Chrysler-built distributors. The set with a blue nylon block is for models prior to 1962. Sets for current models have an off-white block.
The ventilated points minimize oxidation and metal transfer.
These new point sets are pre-aligned to help assure full point contact. Point alignment is important because full contact helps get rid of heat. Point tension must be right, too. High pressure wears the rubbing block. Low pressure lets the points bounce and misfire at higher speeds.
Well, you haven't said anything about point gap.
Here's the story on point gap. A narrow gap causes arcing. A wide gap can cause a high-speed miss. So be sure and adjust points to the specified gap for the car you're working on.
Don't you ever blame the condenser?
Sure, but don't forget high resistance at either the ground or pigtail terminal is just as bad as a faulty condenser. If the condenser circuit's okay, test the condenser.
Boy, you make ignition service sound like an art.
Well, believe me, Tom, top-notch ignition service is a science.
I've seen owners of stalled cars that think it's an art. The lost art, that is. Now I'll let you in on a secret. Gene skipped dwell, vacuum and centrifugal advance, and ignition timing so you won't get out of the study habit this summer. You'll find your homework in my newest book, The Master Touch.
Thanks a lot, chum. Say, I see sections in here on carburation, cooling, lubrication. Do I get the lecture course on those subjects, or is that part of my homework, too?
Both. I'll give you my quick lecture now, and you can study the details later. Carburetor service starts with the air cleaner. Don't minimize the importance of cleanliness. Clean it by blowing air from the inside out. In other words, blow it back out the way it came in.
I never thought of that. But air from the outside would drive the dirt deeper into the filter paper.
Correct. And banging the element might damage it, causing a leak.
You know, Tom, too often the choke adjustment is blamed for hard starting and poor engine performance until the engine is warmed up, when it's only the carburetor choke piston sticking. Gum deposits bind the piston when the engine is cold.
Well, how do you take care of that, Gene?
I've been able to keep pretty clear of those cases by injecting a bit of Mopar or Cryco carburetor cleaner through the piston link opening in the air horn every time the air cleaner is removed. I move the valve back and forth a couple of times to flush out the deposits.
Does that really work?
It sure does. Now, depending on local fuel and driving conditions, this preventive treatment might have to be performed more frequently. Another thing, I always make it a point to tighten the air horn screws and the main body to manifold nuts whenever the air cleaner is off. Air and fuel leaks at the carburetor or an air leak at the intake manifold sure upsets the air-fuel ratio.
And that could cause starting and performance troubles.
It sure could. Now, here's a hot tip I just picked up on 6-cylinder engines with a Holley carburetor. On the single-barrel Holley, the wet fuel level can be measured on the car with engine running by removing the economizer. Level should be 11/16 of an inch. I turned out a couple of high float level jobs before I found out how to lick the problem.
You had a comeback?
No, just a do-over job. I found out that by using a 3/32 drill between the float and the gauge touch point, the wet level measurement checked out right every time.
How about telling Tom about the simplified idle speed specifications?
Good idea. For example, on all 1960 through 62 slant six-cylinder engines, the idle speed is 550 to 575 RPM. On all eight-cylinder models, except those with two four-barrel carburetors, the idle speed has been standardized at 500 to 525 RPM. On eights with two four-barrel carburetors, the idle speed should be 725 to 750 RPM. Now, on cars with automatic transmissions, disconnect the transmission throttle linkage so that the throttle lever stop in the transmission will not interfere with carburetor throttle lever movement. And push the end button in to take the transmission load off the engine.
On air conditioning and alternator-equipped jobs, you want the load from these units on when you set idle.
Tech's right, Tom. On air-conditioned cars, be sure the full compressor load is on the engine. And on alternator-equipped cars, lights must be on high beam position while setting the idle. Otherwise, the engine is apt to stall at every stop.
You better cut your short lecture shorter, Gene. We're running out of time.
Before I sign off, I want to mention the fuel filter. Our local gas is pretty good, and the regular 16,000-mile filter replacement helps me and my customers out of trouble. But last week, I got a filter lesson myself. An out-of-state car limped in here, and the owner was fit to be tied. A road test confirmed his claim that it wouldn't run right above 50 miles an hour. Less than 12,000 miles on the car. To make a long story short, the fuel filter was 3/4 plugged and starving the carburetor. Probably a bad tank of gas or two did the damage. That experience convinced me that in some areas, mechanics probably have to look out for plugged filters at low mileage.
I never realized how many important little details a master technician has to think about in order to turn out a good job every time.
My dad was a machinist. He used to tell me, try not to make the same mistake once.
Well, I'd say any technician who doesn't make the same mistake twice has the master touch. Will you men out there do me a favor? Read the reference book for this session. The best we can do in a 20-minute film is hit the high spots and start you thinking. Try this thought. Satisfied customers come back for fee. Dissatisfied customers come back for free.